In the book, when I talk about the different genres of storytelling, I talk about value storytelling, sales storytelling, product storytelling. When I come to brand storytelling, I really do think of it as world building. And that arrow of coherence, that cause and effect logic has to shine through, I think, in a brand.
You've built a brand story, invested in messaging, campaigns, and content, but the moment it crosses departments, teams, and AI tools, it fragments, and no one can explain why. Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm Park Howell. You're in luck because Gavin McMahon is here today. He's a recovering mechanical engineer, founder of a 25-year leadership and storytelling consultancy, and author of the new book, Story Business: Why Stories Rule the World and How They Can Reinvent Your Business. Today, Gavin's going to reveal why most companies are trapped in a synonymous mess of purpose, vision, mission, and strategy. You'll discover how his Arrow of Coherence creates the cause and effect logic that governs every decision in your organization, why your CEO is your most underutilized storyteller, and how to stop AI from amplifying your fragmented story. Because coherence isn't just a brand asset, it's your business operating system. Hey, Gavin, it's great to see you again, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here, Park.
Yeah, you had written something on LinkedIn a couple months ago that really got my attention and drove me to your book because I didn't realize that you had a book out. There are lots of books out there in the world. And when I started studying your approach, this Arrow of Coherence that you talk about, I thought was really fascinating. That you and I got on a quick call, chatted. It even led to an article that I wrote in my brand story ops for agencies newsletter on LinkedIn. So thank you for that. You were inspiration for that. And it's just great to have you here so we can take a deeper dive into it.
Yeah, it's awesome. I feel like when you coined the term story ops, you put a word around something I've been trying to think. I knew was there, but I couldn't quite figure out how to describe it. And I think story ops is a great way of describing it.
Oh, thank you. You know, we in our lives have come across large enterprises, companies that they have marketing ops and sales ops and HR ops and supply chain ops and financial ops, all of
Yeah.
these silos really that have their own governed system on how to operate. And hopefully you can tie all those silos together. Well, per your book and your insights, and what we have found too, is that what is the one guiding thing throughout all those silos, and that is the company's narrative, be it we call it their brand story, the world making, as you talk it, the story making. And so your book really takes an interesting look on how to activate story ops, or what you call Arrow of Coherence, which I want to talk about in just a second, how you came up with that. But first, you are a recovering engineer. You didn't come at storytelling like I did through branding, advertising, marketing, which would be probably a more normal approach. You came to it from the engineering approach. And I can't tell you how many engineers laughed at me and said, your storytelling stuff is woo-woo. So how did you come about it?
Yeah, well, I'll make the story short. First of all, I have a black shirt, so I feel like I can pass for the people that are in marketing. So I'm originally an engineer. If you either you're drawn to that profession or you come out of that profession, I think you automatically want to pull things apart, figure out how they work, and put things back together again. That's the kind of MO for an engineer. And the other thing that comes out of going to engineering school is a belief that there's got to be a way to figure this out. But you do have this very black and white rules of physics view of the universe. And I think over time, as I, went from pure engineering, I was first working on nuclear submarines and then tanks and then into manufacturing.
And what kind of engineer were you?
Mechanical engineer.
Mechanical. Okay.
Yeah. So in the stack rank of engineering, that's kind of towards the bottom because it just goes, how good you are at maths. So you've got aeronautical engineering up at the top, and then electrical engineering goes down. But so, yeah, I was a mechanical engineer, and I think all engineers think that there's got to be a way, to figure this out. And they usually have a very, this is the way it's going to be done, kind of process, black and white view of the world. And over time, as I work more and more in the business and outside of the core engineering function, you start to work with people. And people are going to make things great, and they're also going to mess things up. And so I kind of discovered this. Well, there was a line in a poem by Muriel Rukeyser, which is the world is made up of stories, not atoms. And that's always struck with me because it's a great line, first of all, but it's so counter to the worldview I grew up with. And but I think about people and I think of the way people process information, make decisions. I actually think, she probably had it right. The world is made up of stories, especially the stories that stick in people's heads, not so much atoms. So it's a little bit of both. Yeah. It's a long and winding road.
Was there a defining moment in your engineering life? Was it just the reading of that quote, or was something else hit you that like, oh, I've got to pay attention to the mechanics of storytelling for what it can do to actually move people?
Yeah, it's honestly, it's a really boring story, but I can remember an
I'll be
instance
the
where
judge of that.
I was running a factory in Africa. It was a proper management thing, not an engineering thing. I'd been building these factories, and we had Coopers and Lybrand came around, the auditors, and I always thought, well, if you're an accountant, it's in the name, you count stuff. So I was taking them through the warehouse, and we were looking at boxes of stuff, and there was, I don't know, a box of bolts, and there were 1,000 bolts on the label for this box. And so they were doing an audit and saying, do you have what you say you have in your assets and in your stock and in your inventory? And they got to the box and I showed them the box and they said, yeah, that looks good. And I was blown away because I didn't understand why they didn't want to open the box and not count the 1,000 bolts that were in the box, but it was good enough. And so, that was my kind of first exposure to, there's actually a whole bunch of people that think differently from engineers. And then I got to marketers, and that's a whole different.
Well, I was going to say, how did that, 1,000 bolts in a box lead to storytelling? What's the aha moment there?
Well, because I think so over time, I think companies, all companies, the clients that we work with, they basically they're there to create value, and I think the very simplistic view is they're there to create value for their stockholders, their shareholders, their investors, their employees, and all of this. But somehow you're bringing people together to create value. And I also think that you've got 1,000 people in your company. You've got 1,000 people making decisions every day, big and small. This is why story ops, I think, is so interesting as an idea, because those people are making decisions, and those are good decisions, bad decisions. They're either creating value or they're destroying value. And that could be a small thing like, I've had a rough day, so I'm not going to answer the phone so nicely when I'm speaking to a customer. Or it could be just choosing to have a direct conversation with an employee, whatever it is, you're making those decisions. The cumulative effect of those decisions is creating value. And the more you can get people lined up in the right direction, or in a direction, really, because honestly, I'm also coming to the opinion that it kind of doesn't matter what strategy you have, just pick one and execute against it really well. The more you can line people up and get people motivated in that direction, making good decisions, that's where it is. And to me, that's where story comes in, because we make decisions through story. I don't need to explain that to you.
And so when did you decide to make this major shift in your career to go from being very, mechanical engineering focused into storytelling focus?
Well, I came across to the US from Paris via London with Gartner. And I came across in the mid to late 90s, and I was then in my 30s. And if you were basically 30 years old in the mid 90s, everyone thought you understood the World Wide Web. For some people, it's still called the information superhighway back then. And I was in charge of Gartner.com. So it was a really what would now be called a digital transformation, shifting the company's business model from CD-ROM and paper onto we consume this research via the internet. And it was such a kind of wrangling and herding of cats to get all these different departments onto what should be on the website, how do we service research, how do we provide this to our clients. And to be honest, I did a pretty terrible job because I had this engineering black and white view of the world and said, no, it's this way, not that way. And held my hand up in front of a lot of people's faces and said no. And it didn't work out so well for me. So I ended up leaving Gartner, and then we started this consultancy. Fast forward 25 odd years ago, around about the year 2000, so nearly 26 years ago now. And ever since then, we've been in the space of trying to help companies go through change, which to me involves two things: leadership, because I need to lead people in a certain direction, or the company, people want to be led. They don't like to be managed, but they want to be led. And storytelling, because if leadership is about making a choice, storytelling is how do you amplify that choice, which goes all the way back to here's a decision that I want to create value around.
So do I have this right? You were at Gartner, big famous business consulting, international consulting company. You're 30 years old in the 90s, and you've been tasked with doing this technological transformational change to the World Wide Web, the interwebs, if you will. And yet you sounds like you didn't have a lot of success with there because you were still communicating from that very black and white um, engineering mind. It sounded like maybe you pissed a bunch of people off. It didn't go the way you wanted it to go. And then
Yeah.
in leaving there, you decided to create what is now a 25-year-old consultancy for change management. And what did you learn from your own failures of like, oh, that's actually not how you do it? What we really need to do is to embrace them or get them to embrace the story of change.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is first, that's true. Good listening, good hearing between the lines. I did piss off a lot of people on the way. I'm sure there are a lot of people that still remember me fondly, but there's probably some that don't. Um, I mean, it was successful. We did transition, but it was there was a lot of friction in that. And I think you do learn around how people change. Even before I get into Gartner, when I left business school, so this was in the early 90s, I sat next to someone that was from Seattle in my lectures, and he told me about this company called Mosaic and this thing called the internet or the World Wide Web. And I ended up through business school writing a series of papers and thoughts in strategy about what the internet could become. My professor submitted them to that company, Mosaic, which became Netscape, which for anyone that isn't old enough listening to this podcast, was probably one of the first big IPOs of the dot-com era. It was the publishing engine of the internet. And I ended up working with Netscape a little bit, doing a case study, and I wrote the first interactive case study around that, which was taught at London Business School and Harvard and different places. And so my idea with the case study was not to write it like a regular case study where you can read page 1, go all the way through to page 10, and you've read the whole thing. I wrote it as using hypertext, and so there were lots of links, and there was no index, and you could get lost, and you ended up wandering through, IBM's website or something else, and people back then couldn't navigate the web as easily, and so they were. The net effect was you got a lot of people in the room discussing this case study, each of whom, depending on the path they'd taken, had incomplete information and had a different point of view. And so this case study always ended up in an argument about what you should do, not like any other case study at the time, because everyone had perfect information in those case
Mm-hmm.
studies. So, I've always been on this kick, I think, about how people make decisions. That was a really early one. And I really enjoyed the fact that they were all arguing and they didn't have perfect information and they hadn't read everything, because that is the way the world works. The reason you're arguing with your colleague or the reason that you're disagreeing is you just have a different worldview and therefore a different point of view, and you're just advocating for your side.
As you started getting into storytelling, what were some of who are some of your resources and inspirations? Mine, of course, as with a lot of people, Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey. That led to my story cycle system that I built for brand story development. Blake Snyder with Save the Cat, and a lot of Christopher Vogler, The Writer's Journey. A lot of them. Who impacted you as you grew as a company storyteller?
Well, I'll pick out three. One is Kurt Vonnegut,
Oh yeah.
and you see this on the internet. He he has this lecture, or he wrote a paper as well, but I think he lectured on it around the shape of stories, which I
Yep.
thought was fascinating.
Yep.
Again, because I'm an engineer, I like people that put systems around things. So he was one of them. Uh, I I'm not a huge fan of Joseph Campbell. I mean, I love Star Wars, and I get it. I think it's a bit too complicated for business.
Well, it is.
Uh,
It's good. You're exactly right. It's good for movie making, and there is definitely a system to that. In fact, I'm just reading the Odyssey right now before I go and see it. But
yeah.
that's one big Joseph Campbell hero's journey,
Oh yeah.
systematized storytelling. And I agree with you too that I thought it would be way too complicated to story theorists for business people to really appreciate. That's why
Yeah.
I boiled it down to the 10 steps and show them exactly where it shows up in their
Yeah.
business world.
Yeah. So my second I'd pick up is Emma Coates, who was a storyboard artist at Pixar. And I don't think these are originally hers, but you can see on the internet various versions of the Pixar's 10 rules of storytelling. And a lot of them talk about structure, a lot of them talk about character, and they really are a kind of pastiche of all the rules that have gone before.
Mhm.
And then the last person I would say is there's a book called Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield, which
Mhm.
book I absolutely love, and I read it every 3 or 4 years or so. It's about the Spartan defense of Thermopylae, and what's interesting about it, first of all, it's a kind of treatise on leadership. It's told from the point of view of a Spartan slave who was the body slave of the Spartan king Leonidas, and it was a little bit like Scheherazade in that he was telling the Persian king why the Spartans were like the Spartans and how they fought such a brave defense and what they did. And so that was the point of view of the whole story. And I just love the story because it's about leadership. But I think Stephen Pressfield has also written a lot of stuff, like Do the Work, about how stories work. And
The
so
War
so
of Art is
yeah,
another good one of
yeah,
his. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, well, those are, I mean, great inspirations, and so you, after what, 20, almost 25 years, wrote your book. Did you write a book before this most recent one that came out?
No, I've been writing. I started writing a blog, I think, in about 2010. And my blog was originally called Make a Powerful Point because I was upset with the way people just speak in PowerPoint to each other and then don't understand what they were talking about. And so that was really me practice as an engineer, thinking I had to practice writing. So I got into this rhythm of writing every week. And then over the last 10, not 10 years, maybe 7 or 8 years, I've been writing a newsletter, and that usually has an article, something to do with leadership, something to do with storytelling, something to do with the future of work. And that's usually something that I've learned in dealing with our clients. And then the book, honestly, that was boiling around in my head for years, 7 or 8 years. and I just had to get it out of my head because I had all these ideas that were disconnected. And the act of writing, if anyone that's listening to this, if you if you have stuff in your head and it's frustrating you, you just have to write it down, because that is the way to calm your brain, I think. And so the act of writing, it just started out like that. And the trigger was, honestly, I woke up one morning, probably very, very early, and I had the title in my head and the first line of the book. So very similar to The Business of Story, but I dropped two words. I went with story business as the title. And then the first line was the first stories were wild.
Yeah, and it is the full title is Story Business: Why Stories Rule the World and How They Can Reinvent Your Business. So,
Correct.
in it, you introduce this idea of this arrow of coherence. And I have got another friend of mine who's in the story branding speaking world, Brian Burkhart. He was on my show a couple weeks ago. He was reading one of the newsletters that I put out, talking about, the article of you and this idea of the arrow of coherence. And he loved it. He goes, that is like the best definition I've ever heard of. How did you come about it? And what do you mean by it?
Well, Nicholas Taleb, I think, talks. First of all, I think as a storyteller, you're a bit of a magpie, so you pick things up from everywhere. So I'm not even 100% sure Arrow of Coherence is mine. I think it comes from Nicholas Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan and other books like that. And he talked about the narrative fallacy, which is the idea that we take these disconnected events as human beings and we are constantly trying to make them make sense after the fact. So we kind of retrospectively apply why X happened because. And so he talks about a narrative fallacy, and I think he also talks about an arrow of something, and I forgot what his arrow is. I'll remember it in a while. And then I was just thinking that arrow of coherence is a little bit about how do we connect the dots, because storytelling is really just an editorialization of something to connect some dots for people so that you can basically frame whatever it is in a new way.
And so, how do you use the arrow of coherence? How do you work with your customers to get them to understand it, to buy into it, and to actually implement it?
Well, for me, I talk more about how storytelling is used through uh, different parts of the business. So if you read, and I know you have, Park, but for anyone that's listening to this, if you read Story Business, it's not just about branding and marketing. It's really about how story connects all different parts of the business, which is your term, story ops, right? And I think, I've worked a lot with different marketers over the years, and in some ways, they're always a little bit frustrated. And the reason that they're frustrated, I think, is they get left holding the bag for a lot of stuff, and then they're asked to, make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. So I'll give you an example. This isn't to name names, but this is an industry. Everyone has a cell phone. We started with an iPhone, and when you had your first iPhone, that was a you know 1G, and then you went to 2G, and then you went to 3G, and the cell companies were constantly upgrading the quality of their network, and eventually you got from 3G to 4G to 5G. Now, somewhere inside of AT&T or Verizon, there is an engineer that can tell you the difference between 4G and 5G. That engineer, I can tell you for a fact, did not and could not explain the difference between 4G and 5G to a product manager. And that product manager did not and could not explain it to a marketer. And therefore, marketers were left holding that bag. And all we know is that 5G is something we should have, and it's probably better than 4G. And by the way, when 6G comes around, they'll probably end up doing the same thing. I've seen lots of technical explanations about why it's different, but it never gets translated. And I think that's part of it.
Yeah, and you ask the question, who cares? What do I really care? Not what you make, that 5G, but what you make happen. That I've got fast, reliable, consistent connection no matter where I go in the world. So
Yeah,
presumably 5G does that for you. How it does it, I have no idea.
yeah. I've remembered now the Nicholas Taleb one is what he calls an arrow of relationship. So he's talking about logical links. And I
Mhm.
think I used arrow of coherence to really describe world building. Because in the book, when I talk about the different genres of storytelling, I talk about value storytelling, sales storytelling, product storytelling. When I come to brand storytelling, I really do think of it as world building, and that arrow of coherence, that cause and effect logic has to shine through, I think, in a brand.
So who owns that quiver for the arrow of coherence inside of a company? Who owns that story?
I'm going to tell you an answer that will disappoint you. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm thinking about it because I'm writing another book right now about change and how AI is driving change and how we react to it in business. And I think the answer is the CEO. But I think the CEO has to build a coalition of the willing and get people on board. And I think most CEOs do things by fiat and tell people, and then they leave that disconnection. I think CEOs in companies carry enormous power. They carry organizational power from their position in the hierarchy, but they carry storytelling power. And they should be the ones, even in really, really large companies, they should be the ones that are pointing out this cause and effect. In the book, when I talk about brand storytelling, I use IKEA as an example. And the founder of IKEA, Ingvar Kamprad, who was the first person that, originally he ran it as a mail order catalog. It was not just furniture, it was all sorts of bits and pieces, pens and stationery and other things. But as he moved into furniture, he had this vision about a basically a better furnished world for the common man. There was a Swedish expression that went with that. Um, and that really causes this arrow of relationship, this arrow of coherence, this cause and effect, which I think is fundamental to world building. I mean, one of the things, Park, that I gave you kind of three very uh, classy answers to who are my influences, but I'm a
Mhm.
massive science fiction nerd, and I read all sorts of junk fiction as well. And I think science fiction writers do a brilliant job of building worlds that you kind of want to be transported into. And the worlds are realistic because they make sense, even though they're fantastical and there's no way all of that is real, but they make sense because they have that cause and effect. They have that inherent logic. They have that relationship. And really good science fiction writers do this world building really well. And what I noticed is the really, really good brands, the ones that we could tick off, IKEA, Apple, Patagonia, Harley Davidson, those kind of companies all do world building really, really well. I don't think they intentionally necessarily do it, but once you start to look inside them at, at companies outside of marketing or functions outside of marketing, those rules of cause and effect are in place.
Yeah,
Story arc.
and that's, going back to what we were talking about where you introduced me to this idea of story Bible that Gene Roddenberry did for Star Trek. And
Yeah.
he was the owner, right, of that story. And here's how you write these stories. And he did it for Star Trek to the Next Generation. He owned it. He had the Bible that everyone could work from, but and that had a certain amount of governance as long as he was around. Once he disappeared, then that governance went out the window and things started going a bit haywire. So there's a little bit of difference between who owns the story, the narrative, and who owns the governance of that narrative to make sure, a la Arrow of Coherence and or story ops, that it is being woven or shot through the
Yeah.
organization, that everybody has a certain amount of ownership, but it has to be on with the same narrative. Otherwise, you get this fragmentation, and we all know now that artificial intelligence doesn't care if you've got a fragmented story or not. It's going to grab whatever it can, and
Yeah.
it, like the Klingons, are going to spread that fragmented story to the world, and you're really going to be in trouble. So I go back to that idea of story governance versus the actual story itself. Who owns it, and what is the best way to indoctrinate that? That's probably not the best word, to embed it consistently and coherently throughout an organization.
Well, I mean, you'll have known. Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
You've worked with lots of different marketing organizations in your time. Um, on the political pecking order inside an organization, where do you think marketing usually ranks politically? Like, as in, it's got a lot of clout. Where do you think it is at its worst? And where do you think it is at its best? And then why?
All right. I think it ranks way down the food chain, and probably indicated that your average marketing director in any one organization barely lasts 4 years until you're tossed and the new person comes in. Um, when we would do brand development, roll up our sleeves and get involved, I was thinking of one organization down in Yuma, Arizona, the largest community health center down there called Sunset Health. They brought me in a couple years ago to help them refine, revise their brand story. And when we got it there and we worked with the leadership there, we worked with the board members, and we got it over the course of a couple of months really dialed in. And then they asked me, they said, we want to now embed this in the organization. Which of the leaders should we have? They wanted me to do a next round of training, both
Yeah.
story training and introduce them to the brand story. And I said, I actually don't want to categorize them by leaders of departments. I want to get your influencers in here. Who are the people, regardless of rank, have the ears of your other colleagues there? I said, it could be you, Mr. CEO, right down to the janitor. It could
Hmm.
be a night nurse. It could be whomever, as long as they've got the influence in the ear of the other people around them. I want to have those people first in the room, train them on storytelling, show them the new story for Sunset Health, and then give them the tools to go out and share it with everyone else. So it wasn't a marketing function. It wasn't a sales function. It wasn't an administration function. It was truly an influence function.
Yeah. I like that. I think I I almost feel maybe it gets back to that Mario Rukeyser quote: "The universe is made up of atoms, or the universe is made up of stories, not atoms." Because when it comes to storytelling, and then we try and put this governance around it, and we try and put these rules around it, which I think the rules are helpful, and the governance is a little bit helpful. But to me, that's the difference between a show Bible and a brand guideline. A show Bible uh, creates the room in which you can invent stories. So you can invent stories and narrative about IKEA, or you can invent stories and narrative around Dune because you understand what the world of Dune is like, or you can invent
Hmm.
stories and narrative around Harley Davidson because you understand that. And then a set of brand guidelines tell you you must always use this color, this Pantone, and you must never use that one, and you must always use that font. And so I think this whole idea of storytelling, and which naturally creates fandom, starts to collapse when you put too many rules and regulations around it. And your idea about let's build this coalition of the willing, let's build a group of people, because what you're saying then is it becomes very cultural. And I
Hmm.
actually want this to be a cultural outpouring of what we do and how we behave as a company. And then you get something like a Patagonia or an IKEA, where, in IKEA, the rules of naming the product, the fact that it's always a kind of quirky Swedish sounding name for a bookcase or a chair, and it's never a place name, and it's usually got some strange Swedish letter in it. those are actually hard and fast rules that they go by, but they're not in marketing, they're in product development. They the it's kind of like Simon Sinek. So his very famous TED talk opens up the start with why thing, and he asks that question: why was Apple able to create an MP3 player called an iPod, and Dell basically built the same thing the same time or a year earlier, and no one bought it from Dell, and everyone bought it from Apple? Because Apple had created a world that you believed that they were going to do something new and different. It was in their marketing, it was in their product, it was in everything they did. Dell, it was like, I want to buy a computer from Dell. And so I think when you get overly rigorous, this is why I'm a big fan of show Bibles and I'm not a big fan of brand guidelines. I actually think you need brand guidelines because you need patterns and you need to be able to repeat those patterns.
Well, and I understand too, you want to use the same color red and the same color
Yeah.
gray and the same font and all that stuff because you have to have the consistency. But what we're talking about there is the expression of a brand narrative or message. But what you and I are talking about is the creation, the world building of those stories that get told through that font and through that color and through that imagery and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But it's
Yeah.
the first is where without governance of that story, it can really start getting fragmented. And so, like we've done with our story cycle genie, you can now use AI in a very artful way. I call it artful intelligence because it becomes the brand brain for your story. Everyone stays consistent, but you can then bring your own voice and your own storytelling to the brand, but it locks in that governance across the board.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think you want to ask, is this does this make sense? Is this coherent? Is this something we would do? And I think that's the same question that Gene Roddenberry asked and told his writers when he brought them first into Star Trek. It's why, we're going through a golden age of television. It's why you pay the showrunner so much money, because the showrunner is that kind of voice of internal consistency in saying what it's doing. And you can absolutely use AI for that. You can, but it's got to be very intentional and it's got to be done in an artful way, because otherwise AI will just say you're using the wrong color or you're using the wrong brand.
Yeah.
You've got to use it to help you think, not think for you.
Right. You have to collaborate with it. You're not
Yeah.
just going to offload everything to it and hope that it comes up with something, but it's truly a collaboration tool in that process. Um, who is a surprising brand that you've seen out there that is using the Arrow of Coherence or story ops well that maybe a lot of people don't know about?
So so this is a brand so full disclosure, I know the CEO and I'm invested in the company as well. But there's something we didn't talk about, which I have to explain first. Um, in story business, I talk about this idea of value storytelling, and value storytelling. You could think about this as the answer to the eternal question: is it worth it? You ask that question before you get out of bed every day. Maybe it's a flash, and maybe it's completely subconscious. But is it worth it? You ask that question before you buy something. And so, is it worth it? Is this magnifying effect that stories can have, a value story can have around a brand. And you can look at something like NVIDIA, which is $1 trillion brand, and there's a value story around it. And the value story is essentially AI is a gold rush. And as you think through that story, you know that in a gold rush, the people that make the money are not the miners mining the gold. It's the people selling the picks and shovels to the miners, which in this story is NVIDIA. So no wonder NVIDIA is $1 trillion brand. So what I look at a lot is, in a particular space, what Robert Schiller called the narrative constellation. In other words, where are all the stories going? Because NVIDIA did not create the AI as a gold rush story. It clamped onto it. So I'm a big fan of a brand in the UK called Wild Market. And Wild Market is part of a constellation of stories about there has to be a better way to eat. There has to be a better food cycling system. We're putting too much, bad stuff on our crops. I want to eat healthier. I'd like to live longer. And essentially, what Wild Market is an Amazon for farm to table food direct to a consumer. It's a great little brand, but I think what's really clever about it is it's part of a zeitgeist. And I think brands that pay attention to the zeitgeist and kind of follow that are in good shape. So yeah, that's my answer.
Oh, that's great. You gave me 2 brands to go and take a look at because I've heard of NVIDIA, did not know their story. I'll definitely go and take a look. And then Wild Market, that'll be really
Yeah,
interesting.
WYLDE.
WYLDE. Okay. You had said something earlier. It occurred to me as you were talking just now that one author quoted that what it was, the world is of stories, made of stories, not of atoms.
Muriel Rukeyser. She was a poet.
Yeah.
And I think it's a line from one of her poems is the universe is made up of stories, not atoms.
So what I love about that is let's do the inverse. So the universe is made up of atoms. We all know that. Everything is a vibrating atom. We are all just energy, right?
Mhm.
Even when we pass away, our atoms are still vibrating. As weird as that is, and our soul does something else. But story does have an energy all its own, does it not? When someone tells a story, you cannot help but have the atoms in your brain fire up to picture and actually live to be a part of that story. You cannot help your body from saying, no, that story isn't right, or yes, that story is true and I want to be a part of it. That it has this insatiable pull of energy because it's simply the meaning making tool that all of us Homo sapiens use to make
Yeah,
meaning out of the madness of being alive. So, uh,
yeah,
there's a lot of truth to that statement. The universe is made up of stories, not just atoms, and there is absolute energy in the story. And if in this modern day, companies are not embracing it through your Arrow of Coherence or through the story op mechanism using a tool like the Story Cycle Genie, that the energy of artificial intelligence is going to disperse your energy of fragmented stories everywhere. And you are going to lose momentum. Even your story may become impotent at that point because you don't have that core solid nucleus of it that you need in order to be able to succeed in the amount of noise we all compete in today.
yeah. I think that's so true. I think, I was thinking about the age we're going through now, entering into with AI. And we've gone from an atomic age to an information age. And before that, we went from an industrial age to an atomic age. And over history, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Renaissance, whichever, there's something in the middle of that called an interregnum, which means, I guess, between reigns, if you look at the Latin. And I think we're actually not in an AI age right now. We're in the interregnum, the gap between what was and what will be. And I think there's a ton of change. And Jeff Bezos said this really, I think this is a kind of a strategy that he uses all the time. When there's a lot of stuff changing, look for the things that won't change. And what won't change is humans will still talk to other humans. Humans will still want to make sense of the world. Humans will still want to buy things. Humans will still want to have relationships. And underneath all of that is story.
That's brilliant. Hadn't thought about that. You're right. We do say we're in the, and I do say we're in the age of AI, but you're right. It hasn't really arrived. We don't even know when it's going to be completely here. It's changing so quickly. And I see a lot of people are caught flat footed. It seems like they don't know what to do, who to believe, where to go. I see others that just swear off AI. I'll never, ever use it. It has no place in my writing, it has no place in my researching. And then I have others, and I fall into this camp of, I think if you use it right, it could be really artful. It doesn't
Yeah.
need to be artificial. It has helped me become a better writer, a way better, faster researcher. It spurs ideas in me over and over and over again, by the thousands, it seems like, of things that I could do and talk about that would have otherwise taken me years to get to, that now I can sort of test them, proof them out using artful intelligence, and then find the ones I really want, and then bring my own experience to that writing, to that story. Like that issue in my LinkedIn newsletter that you inspired in me because I did not know of this story Bible of the Star
Mhm.
Trek world, and I thought that was really fascinating, comparing what it used to be way back in the '60s to where we are today. So yeah, we are right in the thick of it right now, aren't we?
Yeah, and if you think about it, I think story ops, the story cycle genie, or you could kind of roll your own with AI. It probably wouldn't be as good, but what you're really looking for is, if you think about, um, when you're creating something, where you're creating a marketing campaign, you there's so many moving parts. It's difficult to keep it straight in your head. So I'm writing a book, and I'm using AI to help me write the book. So I want to be really clear about what that means. AI is not writing any words for me. I'm writing the words. And the reason I'm writing the words is I like writing the words.
Mhm.
Um, but what AI is doing is, I have this cast of characters in the book, six storytellers, in fact. And each character has a motivation, each character has a flaw. And it's really difficult to keep those things straight in my head. And each character has an arc that they go through. But I'm using AI as I write it, and I basically load that into AI and say, have I broken any of my rules? Have I broken my arrow of coherence that I set out at the beginning of this? And it's saying, yeah, this person would never say that. And I'm like, oh, yeah, yeah, you're right. It would never say that. And then sometimes I'm writing a scene, and I'm having a person say something or do something, and it would say, well, it would never do that. So I go in and I say, well, I like that person doing that, and it makes sense to me. And actually, this makes it a more fully formed character. So I'm going to go back and change the guidelines that you're using that will tell me that I'm going to change the canon.
Mhm.
So I think it's a useful tool if you let it help you.
Yeah, if you are collaborating with it, not
Mhm.
just giving all of your agency to it in hopes it's going to create something worthwhile. It's not. It's going to create slop, and you don't want to be associated with it. So, as we wrap up here, Gavin, what are the 2 or 3 things a listener or viewer could do today to start bringing this arrow of coherence, this idea around story ops, to govern, to protect, to install a narrative that really is going to work hard for everybody, because it's going to avoid the narrative entropy and the fragmentation that happens when you are not paying attention to it?
Well, I'll give people a starting point, and I think there's probably Park. You have a system with story ops that's an equally valid way of doing it. Um, I would say to anyone that hasn't read Story Business, give Story Business a try. I think it lays out a lot of the stuff. But I
Marvelous
think if you're
book.
if you're in a company, I think what companies tend to do is they use a lot of words that create what I would call a synonymous mess: goals, mission, vision, strategy, and it's all the same words in a one big model. I think where you have to start, and this creates this arrow of coherence, is you have to separate out things like purpose, which is what propels you, what gets you up in the morning, from vision, which is where you want to go, from mission, which is how do we get from where we are to where we want to go, from strategy, which is the path that we're going to take. Once you start to tease apart all these things, then you can start to build the framework for the internal narrative, the kind of strategic narrative that you tell people and how you want people to line up against your resources. It makes the job of the marketer that's in your organization so much easier because they completely get where you'll want to go rather than they're just trying to create a little campaign that attaches to the end of some big elephant that you've already got going. So I think starting there, and I don't think there's many companies that really do that. I think a lot of companies live with the pain of that synonymous mess where everything is a little bit tangled. And it's always I would say, a kind of career limiting conversation to have that with your CEO, because there's no CEO in the world that likes to hear nobody understands your strategy. But
Right.
there's a good chance it's true.
Oh, so true. So, final question. What do you know today in the world of storytelling that you wished you had known back in the mid 1990s when you were that young Gartner professional trying to institute change management in the world of the World Wide Web?
That is a good one. Um, so I have two things that spring to mind. The first is everyone is the hero of their own story. And so it's okay. You need to accept that how people are behaving is because their world is revolving around them. They are the hero of their story. The second I would say is that the truth is not driven by facts. And I've only recently come to believe this to be true. The truth is driven by the story you tell yourself. So it doesn't matter how old you are, how heavy you are, uh, whatever you think about yourself. These are kind of objective facts that you were born in a certain age and you're now this. It's the story you tell yourself. Now, obviously, there are some limits of physics in all of that, but I think people are so driven by the story they tell themselves. And your job as a leader, your job as a friend is, I think, to give people grace because everyone's the hero of their own story, and also to help them because the truth is the story they tell themselves.
So, is what you're saying is back then in the 1990s, you were telling them a story from your point of view, and damn it, they have to embrace it versus taking a deep breath, pumping the brakes a little bit and saying, wait a minute, let me really first understand and appreciate where they're coming from and how I can connect their world with the world that I want them to embrace.
You should have been a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I'm never sure which.
Well, I've been doing this story thing a long time too, and that's one of the main things. Everything you said there, I'm like, yep, totally agree. Stories have an energy that is beyond anything. We're really the only creature we know that thinks, plans, organizes, and acts in story. Every change management story is fiction that you need to get people to buy into to make it fact. In order to
100%.
do that, you've got to trigger the energy going on between their ears, literally synapses that are firing that might have been firing with, no, that'll never work, to, that's a possibility. I want to be a part of that. That is
Yeah.
truly change and energy management. Can't think of a more powerful tool than story to do that. And thank you for your great book. I highly recommend it to anyone out there. Business storytelling, business story, and you cover so many great points in there. Thank you for writing it, making it available, and thank you for being here with me today, Gavin. I'm so happy to have met your acquaintance this year.
Well, likewise, Park. Thank you for reading Story Business. Thank you for talking about it. It's been a pleasure to meet you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Gavin, and I really appreciate you being here. And I'm wondering now, have you considered the fragmentation of your brand story and how to overcome that? Your first step is to simply go to storycyclegenie.ai and get your free brand storytelling assessment. You'll just upload your URL to your website, and it's going to give you, in under a minute, a grade, A+ to F-, depending on how well you're doing, and a 14-point storytelling assessment that will validate what you're doing well, reveal gaps that you can quickly fix, and inspire you with new ways to tell your brand story. So do that right now at storycyclegenie.ai. And join me next Monday when Lindsay Busfield's going to be here. She is the Vice President of Optimize My Firm and is going to show you the importance of finding a niche for your own agency and then how to use SEO, GEO, and AEO search optimization to be found in the massive amounts of people that we're all competing in. So join us for that. And until then, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make that one epic. Thanks so much for listening.